Matthew Touch, and I'm talking with Dr. Hollis Robbins, who is the Dean of Arts and Humanities at Sonoma State University. We're going to be talking today about Frank Yerby, and specifically about an aspect of Frank Yerby you may not know much about, his poetry, and his early poetry in writing sonnets. So, good morning, Dr. Robbins.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be talking about Yerby with you,
Yes.
who's the most prolific Yerby scholar I know at this point.
There are plenty of prolific Yerby scholars, and thank you for that. I can name a few more that I may give more props to, because I'm just coming into him, and I haven't even put a dent probably in reading his 33 novels. We still have a ways to go with that.
Excellent.
But I've contacted and talked with you about Yerby before, and you've done pieces on his poetry, specifically the poem that, of course, Bruce Glissard and Laurie Champion talk about, The Fishes in the Poet's Hands, which was published at Fisk, I think, in 1938. But before we talk about that, can you just tell us how you even came across Yerby? You were kind of telling me a little bit about that before we got started recording, and really fascinating story.
Thank you for that. I'll first say that I came across Yerby in writing my book, Forms of Contention, the African-American Influence in the African-American Sonnet Tradition, which is about sonnet writing by African-American poets for the last almost 200 years since Wheatley. Wheatley has one sort of sonnet. And in just, vacuuming up sonnets by African-American writers all over every place I could find them, particularly in the Black press, where they had sort of been unpublished for years and years in journals and newspapers. I came across, and also in anthologies, 3 sonnets by Frank Yerby. And I read them and I thought, God, Frank Yerby, where did I know, why do I know that name? And I went over to my bookshelf where I had a whole group of books that I had inherited from my grandfather, who was a member of the Book of the Month Club since the 40s and 50s, and just tons of pot boilers and things like this. And I found this book, Foxes of Harrow, which is, I guess, must have been an early edition. Probably the first one he must have gotten in the mail, and it was read. And it had been in my bookshelf for 25, 30 years. And I had thrown out so many of his books. My grandfather's books is like, when you're in grad school and you're collecting all your Derrida and your Foucault and your Henry Louis Gates, all of the sort of pot boilers have to go to make room. And some reason I kept this book, and I didn't know why. There's nothing about the book, no part of, the front or the back, that says that he's African-American. It mentions that he was at Fisk, but I didn't know what that signified at the time. There was and I wasn't even in the field of African-American literature, but somehow
there's no picture of him on this one either.
There's no picture of him. There's no author picture. It was just like, this could have been any pot boiler from the era, any romance. So I thought, wow, that is cool. And then when I finally sat down and read it, I thought, that's really interesting. Now, my own field, or my own corner of scholarship in African-American literature, is the relationship of primarily 19th century British literature on African-American literature. I first moved into the field after working on the Bondswoman's Narrative monograph that was found by Skip Gates in 2001, 2002, and identified as a slave narrative that had gone unpublished for a century. And I had read passages of it and seen that she had been cribbing from Charles Dickens' Bleak House as part of structuring her novel. And I knew this when I was a PhD student at Princeton, because I was working on Dickens, but I was also interested in African-American literature, and had realized that there was an entire sort of subfield of the ways that African-American authors used, riffed upon, signified upon British literature.
And thinking about my dissertation, I told you a little bit about the influences of Scottish Enlightenment rhetoric, even on things like that.
Yes.
Too. So the way that things work together, and they're not just solitary, which I think is key to Yerby too, with who he's speaking back to and who he's relating back to in his various texts. Because I see, you mentioned foxes in relation to Stowe, I think, to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Dread earlier. And of
Yes, when I
course,
first read it, when I first read Foxes of Harrow, I thought, oh, he must have read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Dread, which is a bloated text. And most of it really is a kind of plantation romance, that you're like, Stowe, stay in your lane, write abolitionist texts, don't write soap operas. But it was, there was some fun parts of it here. And I got the sense that Yerby at least was working in that tradition too.
yeah, and see, with me looking more 20th century, I'm definitely thinking Gone with the Wind, as people point out. And I really see this. I really see this novel though more, Benton's Row. I don't know if you've read that one.
I have not read it. This is the only one. Ooh, that's a nice cover.
Yeah, and there's actually an author picture, a nice author picture.
Oh, that's
But
a nice author picture.
this is a few years later.
It's a little vague too. You're not quite sure what that is.
Right.
Who he is.
So this is 54. This is 10 years after, or 8 years after Fox's, really responding. I see his costume novels really respond to people like Faulkner too.
Well, there's a lot of that too.
With both of these, kind of with Absalom, at least with Benton's Row to me, but that's a whole nother discussion. But you mentioned his sonnets, and like I said, a lot of people know that he wrote, the costume novels. He wrote all these other novels, these historical novels. Mm-hmm. My story is kind of similar to yours before we get into that, about actually finding him. I found Fox's at a book sale. I found a couple of Yerbys, I think the Golden Hawk and a couple of others. And they were on the shelf like $1, maybe $2 or $3. Picked them up. They were first editions. But it wasn't until I came across, I told this story a lot, but until I came across Speak Now, which is his 23rd novel, the cover caught me. Because those other ones, I was like, I'm not going to read those. They're just kind of like these historical romances or these costume plantation romances. But this cover really caught me with Harry and, Kathy. So Harry, the black expatriate jazz musician, and Kathy, the white woman, daughter of a tobacco magnate in North Carolina. Harry's from Georgia. They're in France. Mm-hmm. And that cover just kind of struck me, especially with the student protest in the background. It takes place in Paris. So I read it. And it's his first novel, out of the 23rd novel, his first one with an African-American protagonist. So doing that, I think, primed me to go back and read, say, Fox's. Which is interesting. And we mentioned too the prologue to Fox's and how some versions don't have it. If you're not primed with those things, it's not.
Oh my God! I mean, I was reading it again this morning, last night. Oh my goodness! I mean, it's so extraordinary because you get, I came at him primarily through the poetry and how he had a sense of line. He understood. We were talking a little bit before about iambic pentameter. And what's interesting about sonnets in the African-American sonnet tradition is that you see how, not rare, but not characteristic of the genre, of the field, iambic pentameter is. So, for example, someone like Frances Harper, who was such a well-known 19th century poet, and I've written on her, I published an edition of her novel, Iola Leroy, and I know her poetry well, hardly ever used iambic pentameter. She was primarily tetrameter, and primarily the blues meter or the ballad meter. And so, there's a lot of questions. I mean, one could ask a lot of questions. What is it about iambic pentameter? What is it about the line, which is the characteristic line of British poetry, of Shakespeare, onward, of blank verse, that wasn't particularly used by African-American poets? And so I'm just going to read the first paragraph of the prologue. I love this, of the Foxes of Harrow. About 15 miles above New Orleans, the river goes very slowly. It is broadened out there until it is almost a sea, and the water is yellow with the mud of half a continent. Where the sun strikes it, it is golden. Oh, it's such a great, I mean, the next few paragraphs, it's better to see Harrow at night. The moonlight is kinder. The north wing has no roof, and through the eyeless sockets of the windows, the stars shine. Yet at night, when the moon is at the full, Harrow is still magnificent. By day, you can see that the white paint is peeled off and that all the doors are gone, and through them and the windows, you can see the mud and the dust over everything. But at night, the moon brings back the white again, and the shadows hide the weeds between the flagstones. So amazing, his line, who is this person talking to? What do the white and the dark signify there? It's clearly not just the moon. And it's such a confident voice.
I was going to say, I love this. I love the prologue because, I mean, as I see it, in connection with the rest of the novel, he's subverting the whole novel from the get-go with this.
Yeah, because you know how it ends, right?
Right. And speaking to you as the reader, I think in the present, he's totally undermining that Moonlight Magnolia myth with this.
Yep.
And the way that the house looks. And what always strikes me, the language too, but what always strikes me is the only person he mentions here is Aunt Colleen by name. Everybody else is just referenced in kind of like pronouns or these vague kind of like references of who is this. She's the only one who's mentioned by name. Who actually the individual, if you read the novel, throughout the course of the novel, helps Stephen Fox to build Harrow. She's enslaved. She saves his life, tells him when to harvest everything, and he harvests it, and he makes a ton of money. Saves his life by eating crawfish, helps the yellow fever epidemic. She's the one who does it. And he's subverting all of that from the get-go, which is amazing, and which leads us to think too, because this of course wasn't the first novel. This wasn't the novel that he wanted to publish. He wanted to publish kind of more of a people argue social protest novel. This is my own, but the publishers didn't want it, basically for various reasons. And he's kind of straddling this line. I've talked about this with Donna Lynn Washington, who's in the collection Rediscovering Frank Yerby, but he's straddling the line from all these different angles of individuals who want him to do activist, social protest, and then individuals who want him to not go as far with social protest and to just do art, kind of from the publishing angle. So he's really kind of dealing with these conflicting forces. And I was going to say, I see reading Glissard and Champion, and then of course you too, that The Fishes in the Poet's Hands kind of deals with that a little bit.
Well, it deals with that in ways that is that if you are steeped in British literary history, Anglophone history, then you know that someone like Milton or Shelley wrote really strong protest poetry. So if you were going to be in the protest movement, you couldn't do better than to read Shelley. And so can I read some of this? I love this poem. It's so great. The Fishes. When I first, I don't remember even where I stumbled across this, but I immediately cut and pasted it into my like, I've got to go back and revisit this later. I think I had to transcribe it because I had never seen anything like it in African-American poetry. Just the strength of the voice. I made an error in that piece. He was a master's at Fisk, not an undergraduate. Okay, so let me read this. The Fishes in the Poet's Hands. They say when they burned young Shelley's corpse, for he was drowned, and washed ashore with hands and face quite gone, the fishes had, it seems, but small respect for genius, which came clothed in common flesh. The noise his brains made as they boiled and seethed within his skull could well be heard 5 yards away. At least no one can hear mine as they boil, but then he could not feel his burn. And so I think he had the best of it at that. Don't you? I just want to stop there. It's so fantastic. What I noticed when I first read this is that clearly this young man, because he was a student still, was trained by somebody who himself had been very, very current in Shelley scholarship. Because this question of this anecdote about burning Shelley's corpse and hearing the brains boil was a thing that Shelley scholars were talking about. And so when I read this, I mean, it was a very particular era, so back when I was in school in the 70s and 80s, that wasn't something anybody talked about. And prior to that, it wasn't something anybody talked about. But there had been a lot of scholarship on Shelley's funeral and a lot of letters and publishers and publishing of this story. And so what first struck me is that the professor Yerby's professor must have been a highly, highly trained scholar. And whatever, there hasn't been, I think, enough scholarship on the quality of the teaching at HBCUs. But Fisk's, the scholars at Fisk's were top notch. And again, I don't know who his professor was. I don't think I talked about it here in this piece, did I?
I don't think you did in this piece.
But what I did is I had gone back to look at, and it has been a bit since I read it, I guess it was a year ago, but I had done some of the research beforehand, to look at who was writing about this and what his professor would have had him read for him to have such a thorough understanding of the mythology and the scholarship of Shelley's funeral. And so, again, and then take that, internalize it, and then turn it into something that he could work against for himself. Okay, go down a little bit. I'll read the second stanza. Now all the hungry, broken men stand here beside my bed like ghosts and cry, why don't you shout our wrong aloud? Why are you not our voice, our sword? For you are of our blood. You've seen us beaten, lynched, degraded, starved. Men must be taught that other men are not mere pawns in some gigantic game in which the winner takes the gold, the land, the work, the breath, the heart, and soul of him who loses. I watch them standing there until my brain begins to burn within my head again, as Shelley's burn, poor, young, dead Shelley, whom the fishes ate. Then I got up and write a very pretty sonnet, nicely rhymed, about my latest love affair, how sad I am because some dear has thrown me for a total loss. But Shelley had me there. All his affairs turned out quite well indeed. Harriet in the river drowned for love of him, and Mary leaving Godwin's house to follow where he led, quite well indeed. Now, it's hilarious, again, if you know your Shelley history. So, he's sitting here, I love the beginning of this stanza, of being yelled at. And then he retreats in this incredible knowledge of Shelley's life. Just like, you who are yelling at me actually don't know protest literature as much as I know protest literature, and know Godwin, and know Mary Shelley, and know Frankenstein, and know this history. It's fantastic.
That's really interesting, and I'm not as well versed in my British literary history or my British literary, of course, criticism. But thinking about that in regards to protest, and then him moving, even though he was writing in social protest tradition, in the vein, or not necessarily tradition, but in the vein of Wright with his short stories, him using the costume novels as social protest, which I see him doing, is very fascinating thinking about it within that tradition, that connection.
Right. So Mary Godwin writes Vindication of the Rights of Women. Right. Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein. Shelley himself is a social protest in regard to votes, in regards to rights against conservative politicians. I mean, these were as leftist protests. This is as leftist protest a literary family as you could have in England at that time. Right. These were people who were activists. And so he sees this as being in that tradition, and all they see, he says that his interlocutors see is, that he's writing a pretty sonnet. But one of the best sonnets Shelley wrote was England in 1818, 1818, The Mad, Bad, and Dying King, a really extraordinary poem. Do you know that poem, England in 1818, Shelley, right there. Yeah, click on that. Yeah, and this is an amazing poem. And again, I've been thinking about this poem, if I may, in terms of our current leadership. An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, princes the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring, rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop blind in blood, without a blow, a people starved and stabbed and the untilled failed, an army whom liberty side and pray, make as a two-edged sword to all who wield. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion, Christless, godless, a book sealed, a senate, time's worth statute, unrepealed, are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illume our tempestuous day. What a fantastic sonnet, right? So anybody who's, and I mentioned this sonnet in my book as the kind of work that African-American sonnet writers understood that a sonnet can do. You can criticize a leader. You can make a really profound statement about contemporary legislation in a pretty sonnet, right?
Right.
And he knows this, right? Yerby knows this. Okay, I'll finish this. You see, this is ironical and light because I am so sick, so hurt inside. I'm tired of pretty rhyming words when all the land where I was born is soaked in tears and blood and black and utter hopelessness. Now I would make a new strong, bitter song and hurl it in the teeth of those I hate. I would stand tall and proud against their blows, knowing I could not win. I would go down grandly as an oak goes down and leave an echo of the crash, at least behind. So Shelley lived, so at last he died. The fishes ate his glorious hands, and all that mighty bulk of brain boiled when they burned him. It's so fantastic. Isn't that great? So of course he's riffing on Claude McKay there, right?
Yeah.
On the sonnet on and he just ends with Shelley in this crazy way. I mean, it's a deeply flawed and complicated poem, and yet I can't get enough of it.
But it's so fascinating, the connections. I mean, like I said, that the fact, thinking about the influence of him, because we mentioned Aubrey Alson Whitman and his Rape of Florida, which is Spencerian stanzas, which from my understanding, his connection to Spencerian stanzas probably came from Lord Byron, if I remember that correctly. So the influences and the way that these things move and connect with individuals in the classroom or without, but also the way that you think of, Shelley as a sonnet writer. I'm not sure if you think about it as romantic poetry. Like I said, I'm not as well versed as I should be in British literary history, but connects with Yerby in a very interesting and fascinating way. Yeah, I don't know what to say about it yet, but I mean, it's just, it's interesting. And the fact too, that his poetry was published. You mentioned that Bontemps published some of his poetry. I was showing you this, Geerdex Massey, who was in Rediscovering Frank Yerby, talks about his connection with Dorothy West, and Dorothy West published 5 of his poems in Challenge. Brevity, Drought, Miracles, 3 Sonnets, and To a Seagull.
So I do, and these are, I mean, they're not bad sonnets. I was going to actually see if I can find one of them here in my, let me see if I've got it here, in my sonnet book. No, I'm not going to read it because it's not very good. They're not very good. I mean, they're fine. They're what I would call competent sonnets. But to write a sonnet, the point of a sonnet, and what Claude McKay was so good at with it, and what Paul Dunbar was so good at it, is that you really had to make a strong point directly in 14 lines. And I think what I began to understand from Yerby and understanding a little bit better, and we see this in this poem too, exactly, right? He takes a long way around to his point. He's got a lot of parentheticals. Even in The Fishes in the Poet's Hand, that's a lot of parentheticals for a decently short poem.
Right.
And so this man is not cut out to be a sonnet writer, and that's okay, because he certainly understood them. I should say I was laughing because you didn't mention that we're having this discussion during the pandemic of 2020, and we might have had a conversation on Zoom otherwise, but
Yep.
now we're all really good at it. And the background that I'm using for this is Logan Roy's office from Succession, his Waystar Royco office, because every time I'm in a different meeting, I have a different background. So, and since it's a kind of discussion of the power of Yerby's poetry, I thought I would talk to you from a power office.
Well, I was wondering what the background was. I try to make sure my background has my books so I can reach them real quick, the Yerby books, my shelf. But
well, I thought I was going to use, I was thinking the other poem, the other background I'd like to use is this one. This is Freud's office. And that's actually the couch right there where Freud would see his patients.
that would go really well with Lillian Smith because she was very much into Freud.
Okay. So
That
when
would go very well with her.
When I'm having meetings with faculty who really want to tell me their problems, this is this is the better one. But I don't think, and maybe somebody would say that Yerby needs some psychoanalysis. Is that why he hid behind, is that why he hid behind white genres and really didn't come out swinging with race literature? That's not for me to say. I just think he's a really extraordinary writer. And this poem, which I'm glad I discovered and I'm glad we're getting to talk about, I think is a perfect example of the ways that African-American writers saw the Anglophone tradition, not necessarily as, white dominance as the enemy that must be slayed, but as a tradition that included him, or that he could include Shelley. It's not Shelley was opening his arms to include Yerby. Yerby was saying, no, in my life, I'd like to open my arms wide enough to include you and McKay and this entire tradition of how we talk about writers after their death and, how we mythologize them. And I think it's fantastic, and I was really going to be able to write about him.
And that reminds me of a lot of other authors we could talk about later, but not right now. I'm thinking Ernest Gaines specifically for one, but another conversation. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And when is your book coming out? Is there a publication date?
Yes, so it'll be July 15th, Forms of Contention, Influence in the African-American Sonnet Tradition, University of Georgia Press. I cannot say enough great things about University of Georgia Press. They're really great. They put on a lot of good books about African-American literature and studies. And again, I'm delighted to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and make sure to go check out our book. Have a good day.
Thank you. I'm going to take out. When's yours coming out? Yours is May.
May 5th. May, and along with Veronica Watson's collection of Yerby's short stories too, which you must pick up.
Fantastic. What press are you with?
University Press, Mississippi.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, they also put out the other Black Sonnet book, which is Timo Muller's book on the African-American sonnet literary tradition.
Okay.
Which came out last year. Anyway,
make sure to check those out too.
Great.
See you.